Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving straight into a deeply human reality, China's religious policies and the overarching strategy of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, to truly grasp a geopolitical strategy of this massive scale, we honestly can't just read through dry policy documents, right? We need to start with something real. Something like a heavy, life-altering knock on a door at 2 a.m.
Let's start with the raw, incredibly intense story of a woman named Cherry. I mean, you can almost feel the panic of that moment just hearing about it. Her husband, Gao Yongjia, was a pastor for an unsanctioned Chinese Protestant movement known as the Zion Church. And as part of this coordinated countrywide sweep, which actually saw 18 church leaders arrested, authorities literally showed up in the middle of the night, flashed a piece of paper, and just took him away. He was later charged with fraud. Because of this sudden raid, Cherry was forced to pack up and flee to Thailand with her young son. And this poor kid started suffering from severe nightmares, totally terrified that his mom is going to be thrown in prison too. It is a stark reminder that behind every massive state strategy, there are real families whose lives are completely turned upside down.
And this fear doesn't just vanish when they cross the border. It carries a massive psychological weight. Even in exile, Cherry and her community are doing their best to maintain their faith, right? They hold these Sunday services online with over 1,500 people. But it's this kind of digital sanctuary that's just shrouded in darkness, because the vast majority of believers are simply too terrified to turn their webcams on. And they aren't just hiding from the state, actually. They face active, aggressive intimidation even in these digital spaces. Trolls regularly infiltrate their chats, calling them Satan and demanding they be faithful to Chairman Mao and be faithful to the CCP. So the surveillance and the intimidation, they definitely do not stop at the border.
All right, Section 1, a community besieged, the human toll of policy. Moving on to Section 2, two ways to worship, the state's binary system. Okay, so how does this actually work on the ground? To grasp the mechanics behind Cherry's situation, we really need to look at how the Chinese state categorizes belief. It operates on a super strict binary system. Officially, tens of millions of Christians are totally permitted to practice, but, and this is a big but, only at state-overseen registered churches. And these spaces come with a lot of strings attached. They have to display national flags, they're outfitted with CCTV cameras to monitor the congregation, and they require absolute obedience to the state. Then, on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, you have the house churches. These are independent, unregistered movements that just want to worship free from all those state rules. But because they refuse that official state affiliation, they're forced underground and become the primary targets of government crackdowns, raids, and arrests. To put this binary system into perspective, let's look at the province of Zhejiang, and specifically the southern city of Wenzhou. People actually refer to this area as the Jerusalem of China. It's estimated that a massive 15% of the population here is Christian. Now, you'd probably think that in a city with such a dense population of believers, the presence of faith would be kind of relaxed, right? Actually, no. It creates an environment of incredibly high tension and rigorous, strict enforcement of those exact rules we were just talking about.
And this next story absolutely blew my mind because it brilliantly illustrates the intense level of state monitoring, even in those officially permitted state-sanctioned spaces. When foreign reporters recently visited a registered church in Wenzhou, which remember is a church that actively complies with government rules, the local authorities instantly knew they had walked in. Within less than 10 minutes of those reporters arriving, authorities called the church's party secretary, and the journalists were promptly asked to leave. 10 minutes. That is just an astonishing level of rapid response surveillance. They are keeping incredibly tight control over who exactly is interacting with these congregations.
Section 3, the Sinicization strategy, rewriting the rules of faith. So all of this granular day-to-day surveillance, it actually builds into a much broader approach directed straight from President Xi Jinping. It's called the Sinicization strategy, and it is the foundational policy here. Basically, it's an explicit top-down directive aimed at making religion more Chinese. But practically speaking, we aren't just talking about cultural aesthetics here. It's really about tightening state regulation to make absolutely sure that any religious practice aligns perfectly with and is entirely subservient to state authority and the Chinese Communist Party. It is all about closing any operational gaps that might allow for independent thought. And recent edicts make these boundaries crystal clear, turning really dense policy into an everyday reality for believers. Let's break this down. First, clergy are legally mandated to actively support the Communist Party and love the motherland. Second, if you want to worship online, you can't just fire up a generic video call. Churches actually have to use lawfully established platforms that hold a very specific government license. And finally, and this one is perhaps the most striking for the future of these communities, disseminating or inculcating religious ideas among minors is strictly forbidden. You literally cannot teach your religion to children.
Section 4. Erasure and demolition. Removing the physical footprint. Now, what happens when those strict state boundaries are crossed? Well, the response can manifest in sheer physical erasure, which is a brutally powerful tool of intimidation. Take the enormous Nung Church, for example. It was entirely pulled down back in 2014 while its believers just had to stand there and desperately watch. And the official rationale provided by the state for tearing down this massive building, simple building code violations. Today, if you go visit that exact site, there's an old people's home looking over the area. There is absolutely no trace that a massive place of worship ever stood there. Just a complete physical erasure from the landscape.
Let me walk you through a timeline that shows just how incredibly fast state retaliation can escalate. This played out recently in the town of Yangtong. It all started in December when a church simply rejected the placement of a Chinese national flag on its premises. The consequence? Well, shortly after, the cross was forcibly removed from their roof. Then, wanted posters were issued, which led right up to the arrest of the church elders who had stood up to the authorities. And today, the entire church site has been literally flattened. When reporters tried to visit the site recently, they found it heavily guarded by police and were quickly surrounded by individuals who blocked them from leaving until they stopped filming. Open defiance, it seems, results in total erasure.
Section 5. The paranoia of control. Differing perspectives on state motives.
So why is this happening? What is the core motivation behind these heavy-handed tactics? To neutrally examine this, we have to look at both external allegations and official responses. Let's start with the perspective of critics. Bob Fu, who runs an organization that charts religious persecution, argues that the CCP, despite having 90 million members and, literal nuclear weapons, is actually living in deep paranoia. He alleges that the state regards absolutely any organized social structure or any group that it cannot directly control as a fundamental political threat that simply must be eliminated. But to be completely fair and balanced in this explainer, we absolutely must contrast that allegation with the official stance of the state. The Chinese government vehemently rejects these accusations of persecution, absolutely denies them. Their official position insists that religious freedom is fully protected within the country. From the state's perspective, religion is completely free for all citizens, provided they abide by the established regulations, they worship in sanctioned venues, and they align their practices with the broader goals of the nation. Which brings us to the end of our journey today, leaving us with a pretty heavy question to ponder. We've talked about the 2 a.m. arrests, the digital fear, the flattened churches, and the really strict state regulations. In this clash between the incredible, overarching might of the state and the quiet persistence of human conviction, we have to ask, when a government demands total obedience, how far can it truly go to control the invisible, psychological landscape of human faith? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll leave you to think on that.